In this week's video, I'll be taking you through my thought process as I trim a small stoneware lidded jar. From my design choices, to the tools I use, to how I hold them and trim successfully, and all the other small, subtle things that happen along the way that you might not normally notice, and I won't usually share. And before I start properly, I just want to say I'm really saddened by the recent news of Phil Poberker's death. I've been using his turning tools for the better part of a decade now, and they are always the trimmers I lean towards. He was an extraordinarily talented craftsman who made many of us better makers by making tools for us that for the longest time you simply couldn't find anywhere else. So thank you, Phil. I'll be using your tools a lot more carefully from this point on. So, with the majority of the lidded wares I produce, I always make sure that the lid is thrown larger than the opening itself. Not only that, but I throw the component itself larger, both in terms of width and height. I'm not always entirely sure how I'm going to conclude a pot with its lid, so during the throwing stage I simply prefer to throw something, which could become multiple different shapes, as throwing the component slightly bigger than necessary only adds a few additional seconds for the throwing and the trimming. In fact, if I were to try and throw these totally accurately to the absolute perfect shape and size, it would end up taking far longer than throwing something that's a bit rough, like seen here, and then I simply trim away all the excess at the leather hard stage, leaving me with a smaller, lighter component. The larger thrown form also means I can lift them off the wheel more easily and handle them a bit more roughly up until they need to be trimmed. This means though that every single surface of my lids are trimmed, which means they're quite time intensive pieces to create. But I think I've figured out a method that streamlines the process greatly, or rather I've figured out, I think, the best sequence of steps in order to trim my lidded wares efficiently. And that process begins with the lid itself. I begin by tap centering the lid. Tap centering, by the way, is something I won't go into too much detail here, as it's something I've made a much longer, more detailed video about, a link to which I'll leave on screen now and in the description below. As I center this piece, I'm looking to get this corner where the two planes meet perfectly centered, not so much the vertical flange in the center or the outer portion that's spinning around, as I'll be able to trim those parts later and make them perfectly true if they are slightly off. Once centered, I secure it in place with 3 lumps of soft clay, and I push down on the lid as I do this, so it's not shifted off center as those securing lugs of clay are pushed against it. Now, for trimming the underside of the lid, I tend to use these cheap steel tools, as they leave a smooth, burnished surface and won't bite into the clay too much. I need to be careful here, relatively, as if I turn away too much material, I can very quickly make the lid too small for the body of the jar. At the same time, as this component is so low down to the wheel, and so thick and heavy, I can trim really aggressively with the wheel spinning quickly, which is something that I don't think gets spoken about enough. It really does help if you want smooth and even surfaces to spin the wheel fast. As each individual portion of the wall is coming around far more regularly, any small change you make affects the entirety of the shape, whereas if you're trimming and spin the wheel really slowly, you may in fact apply more pressure on one spot, turning away more from one area of the wall than another, thus creating unevenness, or even quite a significant undulation. So don't be afraid to spin the wheel quickly, it will give you better results. Then, to check if the body of the jar fits, I simply lower it over the lid to see if that locating flange now inserts properly. By intentionally throwing the lid slightly too large, I can trim it back to fit the jar perfectly. If, on the other hand, I threw it to be exactly the right size, I wouldn't be able to trim and neaten the outer locating flange, as that would make it too small, resulting in the lid rattling in situ. Yet, for me, the fact that I can't trim it and make it to my exacting standards would be the issue. So by leaving some extra material, I just create a safety net of sorts. The last thing I do is just burnish the sharper edges with my fingertips, as any really sharp edges of clay will likely chip as the lid is placed into the jar. Now, with the underside of the lid trimmed, I remove any remnants of clay left on the wheel head, and to attach the jar to the metal, I'm going to brush a ring of slip onto the wheel the same width as the bottom of the jar. I then place the pot onto this and tap center it, and if there is a chunk of clay you forgot to remove before doing this, it could cause the jar to teeter and lean one way or the other. That's why I'm so careful about scraping the wheel head clean before doing this. By the way, if this process of attaching the pot to the wheel head seems confusing at all, it is another subject I've made a much longer, more detailed video about, links to which I'll leave on screen now and in the description below. Then at the bottom I just use a plastic kidney to press the base of the wall in, sealing it almost. With the jar firmly attached, the next thing I do is trim the walls from bottom to top, which is something I can do when I've attached the pot to the wheel using this method, as there aren't any lugs of clay getting in the way or mechanical arms like you might find on a given grip. When trimming, I normally begin at the top and work my way down. Although there's no real rule for this, I suppose I just begin on the most significant areas, although I won't trim the rim just yet. I'll do that after I've turned the lid, as I need it to be strong enough to support the weight of the lid when it is placed on top and trimmed in situ. And as I can reach my fingers inside this jar, I can feel the thickness of the wall, so I'm constantly checking it as I trim, aiming for a thickness of about 3 or 4 millimeters. I aim, perhaps more than other potters do, for my pots to be really light, which is why you see me trimming rather excessively in many of my videos. This, by all accounts, doesn't mean that you have to trim as much as I do, but as the glazes I use tend to go on rather thickly, if I leave the walls of my pot rather thick and then apply a heavy layer of glaze, the vessel itself can end up far more weighty than I'd like. And that's something I always try and avoid, as I've always loved the idea that when using clay you're essentially using earth and dirt and metals, things found beneath our feet. Yet by being thrown and trimmed on the wheel they can be turned into light, precious objects that are highly covetable, which contrasts the material cost really starkly. For instance, the clay and glaze and fuel cost for making this piece is probably about 50p to £1, yet I sell these pieces for about £250 to £300, which is a remarkable difference. But it's the material cost that's changed through craftsmanship, which I find fascinating, especially with a medium such as clay. When trimming the lower sections of my pots, there's a higher chance that the piece will be torn off centre as I work, so instead of using the entire length of the blade when removing a lot of material, I tend to focus the pressure on just one small point on the blade, such as the corner with this hook tool, as doing so imparts greater force on the vessel but on a very small area. This makes the tool less likely to snag, tugging the pot off centre. This trimmer, by the way, is one of Phil's. It's my favourite shape and the piece I'll covet the most. Now, in terms of design and proportion, there's a very significant thing I do to make sure these pots work, and it's something that's always done wrong when I see people replicating my pots, and that's making this bottom section tall enough. In general, I try to make sure that this bottom section is at least half the height of the entire shape. The foot itself also needs to be narrow enough, and if either two components are wrong, then the piece ends up looking stumpy and heavy. For instance, in this terribly crude little example, I've drawn the lower section to be too short and not narrow enough, and it just doesn't feel very elegant or refined. Yet, if this is elongated, the vessel is lifted up, and the whole thing begins to feel lighter and no longer squat. In many ways then, I think the lower section of these pots is probably the most important, as it tends to be on the upper section of the walls and the lid where I explore more in terms of shape and design. But if this supportive tapering section is wrong, the pot just doesn't feel like one of mine. Proportionally, it just looks off, so I'm always really careful about making sure this lower section is tall enough. This scraping, by the way, is just a way of smoothing over the surface to remove the more significant turning marks left by the tungsten blade, and please be careful when you do this, as it's when cleaning the edge of these scrapers that I've probably injured myself the worst when making pottery. There is nothing fun about a deep, ragged cut left by the edge of one of these tools. Think of a paper cut, only it's much worse, and I'm sure any potters watching will be wincing just thinking about it. So at this stage I've trimmed all of the walls apart from the gallery of the jar, and it's now that I trim the lid, the gallery of the vessel holding the lid in place nicely. If I trimmed the gallery underneath the lid to be really thin and fine and then tried this process, the weight of the lid, the spinner, and the pressure I'm pushing down through this tool can cause it to crack and buckle inwards if it's too dry, or if the clay of the gallery is too soft, it will just bow and bend inward. So it's at this stage when you really want to catch the stoneware in just the right condition, as if it isn't, and it's wrong in either direction, it will only make the process far more difficult. Now, if you are trimming with tungsten carbide tools and you're getting excessive chattering marks, I recommend turning the blade so it's about at a 45-degree angle to the surface you're trimming, as compared to trimming with the blade parallel, like so. When holding the blade at an angle like this, the spinning clay collides with the metal at different points, imparting less force on the blade and helping it to trim more smoothly, which is exactly what you see me doing here. If instead I tried to remove lots of material with the blade perfectly straight, it would most likely leave a chattered surface if it was a tungsten blade. Whereas I can get away with this if I'm using a steel tool, like you see here, as it bites less and leaves a smoother surface. I want the sides of this lid to line up with the wall of clay underneath it, so they angle out together, the shape continuing at the top. I also felt at this point that the lid itself was too thick, and thankfully, as I threw this lid too large to begin with, I can turn away the excess without worrying that I'll interrupt the internal shape, or worse, trim a hole right through it. There is though this patch under the spinner that needs to be trimmed, and generally speaking for the tops of my lids, I turn them to have a very slightly concave surface. This removes just a touch more weight from them and creates an area where glaze can pool nicely if I want it to, in which case the glaze fills this area and fires perfectly flat, whereas if I actually trimmed it to be flat and then piled as much glaze as I normally would on top of that, and then fired it, I end up with a surface that's actually a bit convex, which sort of goes against the angularity the rest of the vessel has. And to do this task, I'm using a really blunt steel turning tool. I'm using this as a precaution, really, as inevitably the clay inside the thicker portion of the lid is going to be slightly more damp, and a very sharp tungsten blade would simply catch on this and rip the lid out of place, or slice through it like hot butter, leaving a lovely deep gouge in its wake, whereas with this trimmer, there's simply less chance of that happening, and due to the angle of the blade itself, I can trim a concave surface a bit more easily too. The only part I need to be careful about here is not trimming too deep in the centre, and as I'm turning, if I feel like this portion is bowing inwards really easily, it means it's probably too thin if my intention is to glaze on top of this really thickly, as a thick layer of glaze over a very thin portion of clay is a good way to create cracks in your work. So if it is on the thin side, I tend to use a thinner glaze on it. You can see here a pocket of air spinning around, so I'll prick this with a needle and then scrape over it, and hopefully all the air will be pushed out and the surface will be smooth. And don't be alarmed about that rough patch left in the middle. The glaze that will coat this will hide everything. So despite it being obvious now, once glaze fired, you'll never notice it. And with the lid trimmed, but still not quite finished, I'll take it off and trim the gallery, thinning the wall out to make it as refined as the rest of the vessel. And it really is very thin and delicate. In fact, it's thinner than most of my vases and other shapes that don't have lids. But as I'm going to be firing this jar with the lid placed on top in situ, supported by wadding so the parts don't stick, this will actually help to keep the rim lovely and round. Whereas if I trimmed this thin, say on a vase, and fired it, there's a really good chance it would warp, as there's nothing in the opening bracing it. To burnish the lip, I just use my nail, like so, to push in any of the coarse grains of grog that might otherwise leave a rough surface. But don't do this too much, especially if you're using a clay body that contains grog, as the spinning ceramic will simply wear down your nail, like sandpaper. I do it on the odd occasion, but if I'm trimming say a dozen pots or more, I'll use a very small kidney to do the same job. And before I flip the pot upside down to finish the base, I just put the lid back on to make sure it still fits. To remove the stuck down jar from the wheel, I use this, a sharp metal knife that's actually only got sharper with use, as it's constantly ground against the metal wheel head. I brace the pot with my left hand, ready to catch it, and then slide the sharp metal point underneath it, severing it from the wheel head. And now I can use the lid like a chuck for the body, which is why I've cleaned the metal so excessively, as I don't want any bits of crud sticking back into the lid I've just so carefully finished. The lid is tap-centered, the jar slotted over it, and at this point, if the base itself isn't spinning on center, I can tap-center the lid of the pot until the base of the vessel, where my finger pushes down on top of, is centered. This way, I'm not centering by striking the thin walls of the jar itself. Rather, I'm tapping the lid, which is still relatively thick, and can take being struck without distorting. The spinner is placed on top and centered. And it's crucial to note that when I'm actually centering the pot at this stage, I'm focusing on the walls of the vessel, not so much the base portion itself, as you can see that the very bottom here, where the jar was sliced off the wheelhead, is actually spinning around unevenly, whereas the walls beneath it are spinning true. So the first thing I do is slice away this unevenness, putting the walls in a slightly more centered position. When I flipped this pot upside down just now, I also felt like there was still a bit of weight in the lower half, so I'll continue trimming this part upturned, like so, and whenever I apply any amount of force at all with the turning tool, I make sure to push down on top through the spinner to counter it. It's really this that keeps the pot pinned in place, as if I were to apply horizontal pressure without anything pushing down from on top, the body of the jar would just tip to one side. This means that when it comes to trimming the actual base of the pot, this same principle must continue, and whenever the blade comes into contact with the clay, I must also apply some pressure to the very center of the vessel as it spins, which I'm doing here with the fingertips of my left hand. I bevel the outer edge and then begin neatening up the base, and instead of using my finger initially to stabilise the bottom, I'm using the blade itself, and then as I work that outward, I switch the pressure to my middle finger on my left hand. My aim with these first few passes is just to neaten up and flatten the bottom, especially the outermost edge, as I can feel that the base is relatively thick on this piece, so I should be able to trim quite a deep footwell into it, carving away the excess clay in the bottom to make the pot lighter, whilst also adding a subtle decorative feature. If this was a pot designed to keep hot liquid in, it would also help keep the liquid warmer for longer, as less of the pot's material comes into contact with whatever surface it's placed upon. And throughout this process of hollowing out the footwell, that same idea of constant pressure being applied in the very centre is maintained. And for this task I like to use a really sharp tungsten carbide tool, as it bites and carves away the clay without having to push down too hard. For instance, if I was using one of my less keen steel tools, I'd have to use a lot more downward force for the tool to bite and remove material, which could, in part, depending on the thickness of the bottom, cause it to bow inward, thus deforming the shape of the base. In recent months I've been making the outermost portion of the foot, the part that actually makes contact with the table, finer in terms of width, as in a way I want it to match the rim and lid in terms of their level of finesse. And in the past, when I left them thicker, they felt a bit clumsy and hefty when the feet were trimmed to be much wider. This is always a tense moment, in a way, as all it takes is just one tiny slip for the entire foot to be ruined. You only need see my previous upload as proof for that. The last step for the foot itself is for it to be carefully burnished smooth, just like the underside of the lid or the rim of the body, as these will be the only regions of exposed bare clay after the pots have been fired. When I'm burnishing the clay itself, I'm not using the edge of this tool, rather I bend it in such a way that I can push against the clay using this portion, the smooth underside, and it's this that creates the lovely glossy finish on the feet. And lastly, for the body at least, I stamp the beveled foot with my maker's mark. This impression does cause some clay to become displaced, so it's necessary to flatten the bottom once again, otherwise you can end up with a bump that could eventually cause the pot to not sit flat. That's the body trimmed. It's lovely and light, and I'll place it onto one of these HPL bats so that there's no chance that the bottom of this pot is impressed with any texture, which can happen when you place leather hard pots on wooden bats or wearboards. Now there is a bit of damage on the underside of the lid to fix, such as some light scratching, some scruff marks left from where the rim of the body of the jar has rubbed against the underside of the lid. I also tidy over the surfaces themselves using this very specific steel turning tool that has rounded corners and a simple flat blade, which leaves lovely smooth surfaces without any slight scratch marks left from the corners, which can happen with sharper tools with right angles on the sides. I then flip it over and check for any damage on the top of the lid, and if I see any slight scratches or indentations, I'll simply burnish the edge with the smooth side of this metal kidney. I still want it to be practically a right angle, so I won't soften it too much, and this leaves me with a far more refined component, although when placed on the body of the jar, it still felt a touch tight. So back onto the wheel it goes, and one last millimetre of clay is removed. And that fits really nicely now. From this point, I won't twist the lid in situ again, not until the pots have been bisque fired and the clay hardened, as it's still incredibly easy to damage these delicate surfaces, so I really try and interfere with them as little as possible as they dry. And finally, out of my own interest, let's weigh these components. The lid is 107 grams, and the body is 243, although their combined weight will jump up a bit after a thick layer of glass has been fired around the outside of the vessel. The last thing I'll speak about is the use of a mirror, which if you've watched my videos before you'll know I hammer on a lot about, but I can't just skip over it as it's so fundamental in my making, as throughout this entire trimming process, it was the mirror I was looking in really, as compared to this slightly distorted view from above, which is also how I shot this video. By looking through this mirror as I work, I see a perfect side view of the pot I'm making in front of me, which for a shape as angular as this is immensely useful, especially when it comes to things like assessing the proportions between top and the tapering lower half, so please do give it a go if you haven't tried. Anyhow, that's all for this week. A quick, in-depth look at trimming a jar, a simple video before a few more complex ones coming in the following weeks. Thanks so much for taking your time to watch, and I'll see you next time.